Welcome to Big Brave Business. This is the podcast where we answer big questions reshaping entrepreneurship. I'm Sarah K. Heeter, and this is Season 3. Each week, I'm bringing on my friends, mentors, and some of the best thought leaders I know. We dive into bold, values-driven conversations about leadership, equity, ethics, and building businesses that actually make a difference. Ready to do business better? Let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. I am thrilled to introduce the podcast to my friend and client, Diane Ortega of the Midwife Life podcast and the creator of the Rebirth Journey. Welcome to the podcast, Diane.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. And this is a topic today that I think is hard to say I'm excited to talk about because it is not a overly happy topic. But what we would talk about today is grief in the business journey. And I think I might have touched on this a couple of years back in the podcast, but it's something that I became aware of in my own business journey a few years back. And I found, man, nobody talks about this, about how much grief is a part of the entrepreneurship experience of the journey and kind of never stops being part of it. And you are going through a pretty significant pivot in your life and in your career. And you've shared some things online on your podcast, on your blog, on social media about just pivoting in general is what you help people with, but also with your own grief. And so I guess let's just start there. What's going on with you? What comes up for you when I say this about grief in business?
You really touched on something. No one told me that when you build a business, there would be grieving over and over again. And there is. And it's not always the things that go wrong. Before we were recording, talking about some of the things that go right, but just aren't fitting right anymore, right? There's growing pains and you grieve what you had before. So it is something that nobody talks about. No one talks about Bruno, but it's not something you would really think about in entrepreneurship or running a business that you would encounter that. So I think we talk about things like pivots and burnout, but there's so many other areas that you can feel the grief that people don't understand.
In my master's program, I studied public policy and public administration, but I did an emphasis in change management. And the very first change management class I took, and what really shaped my idea that actually I wanted to work in operations and change management, this was before I started my business. We talked about how with change, like when something changes, people experience stages of grief. And this applies in the workplace, even with something as simple as changing the project management system that you use, your team experiences the stages of grief in that. And so as you have a larger team to manage, you also need to be great at managing their grief when you introduce change. Now, even though I learned this in the classroom and I found this so fascinating, it wasn't until I found myself experiencing it as an entrepreneur that I realized you also have to handle your own grief. You're also going to have to navigate your own. That seems like a duh, except I thought of it as a people manager. This is what
Right.
I need to be able to do for my people, not as a people manager, or even if you're a solopreneur, you're also going to feel that. And so the example I shared with you before we hit record was, and actually, if you've been listening to this podcast, if you're an OG and you've been listening to this podcast since the beginning, you know who I'm talking about because she was my original co-host of the show. But Amanda was such a huge part of my business. She was the first person I hired at Podfox. And so she literally was my VA. And also we started this podcast together. She was one of my closest friends. Still have such deep love for her. We catch up every now and then, but it's not the same. And I knew it wouldn't be. So when she made the decision to leave both my business and the podcast at the same time, and I knew this was going to be a really huge change and shift in my life, the grief was so massive. And I found myself like playing this slideshow through my head of like all the things we shared together and all the things she was like such a big part of in my life with not just starting Big Brave Business, but also coming up with the name Podfox. When I hired Amanda, like I just did business as Sarah K. Heeter. And actually that was like such a big incentive to change it because her email address was amanda@sarahkheater.com. And I was like, I don't love that. So I was like, okay, wait, we're past the solopreneur part of Podfox and I need like to rebrand. And so she was part of all of that. We picked the colors together. She introduced me to the brand designer that we used. Like she was there every step of the way in building that. And it did make sense when she stepped away and for both of us. And I was so fucking sad. Like, yeah. So, anyways, that's when I really started exploring this kind of concept of grief. But sometimes it looks much bigger than that, right? Like, that's a happy reason to have grief to a certain degree because I was moving into a new level of the business. I love where the podcast has come. Like, I'm Big Brave Business is my favorite thing I do in working. And so like I can't be sad that this version of Big Brave Business exists, but I'm also and so I'm thrilled, but I also am sad that the old version can't exist at the same time. I don't know. That's a lot. So anyways, that's what like kind of some examples of navigating this have looked like for me, but what like what's coming up for you?
Well, obviously, my biggest, I mean, I talked about the fact that I owned, I co-owned birth centers for 10 years, and there were periods of grief with letting staff go and like losing the vision of the original thing that we built. But we recently closed all of the birth centers. And with that, like it was such a big decision to make to do it in the first place. So you think I'm so I'm so naive. And if anyone would have like brought this information to me, I'd be like, girl, you're so silly. What are you talking about? Like I thought we made the decision, okay, it's all gonna be good. And then when that last day that we're gonna be open comes, everything's gonna like turn around and be fine. But that's not exactly how that works, right? I think I was just being a little bit delusional about that. And what's come up for me, this is only April 30th that we closed. So we're recording this in early June. So it really has not been a long time that I've been sitting with this, but there's a lot of layers of it. And the first one that came up was my identity. Like I am still a midwife and I always will be. I'll keep that. And that didn't disappear when we closed the birth center, but I'm not a birth center owner anymore. And that was part of my introduction of who I am and what I do. And it's like I built that role and I showed up in it and I poured myself into it. Like that business was my heart, blood, soul, everything for the 10 years that we were there. And so that was a real loss. And like sitting with that this last 6-ish weeks has really been an eye opener and just crazy. But there's other layers too. Like my business partner and I decided that it was time. Like there's a long story behind all of that, but we had to grieve for the dream. Like this was a dream that we had. We came up with the idea and like built the business in about a year and opened. So for 11 years, it was a dream and we had a vision for it. You know, we had hoped that we at one time had 3 birth centers. We were hoping to like get them super successful and sell them because we're getting older and we didn't want to stay up all night. But I've had to grieve the actual dream of having these birth centers. And with that, with that part also comes the community. What we built for in our community was something that isn't going to exist anymore unless someone else opens another birth center like ours. And there are some birth centers in Arizona, but none of them take access. None of them took all the insurance plans that we did, like TRICARE, and it offered services that we did. And that made me sad. And telling clients the last 2 months that we were open, we were closing, and they were crying because we've changed their lives. Like there's a layer of grief for that as well. So it's just been so many layers to work through. And I it's not like this going to be an overnight thing that all of a sudden I've worked through it all, but I feel like just acknowledging all the different layers has really helped me to like start to come up from the rubble on the other side.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. it's both, I think, for me, is like recognizing it as grief is helpful. And it also makes it's almost like it gives you permission to be sad. Because I think for me, there's a point where you're like, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm anxious. Like, what is this that I'm feeling? And then as soon as you're like, oh, it's grief, then it's like the balloon pops and you're like, it's not stress. It's way more than that. There's stress in it, but like it's actually so layered. And it's not as simple as sadness either, because grief has a lot of stages, right? So like, and I don't really even know necessarily if the quote unquote 5 stages of grief is like necessarily still like considered the best way to describe what grief is. I think we understand there's a lot of nuance to it. I don't know, I'm not a grief expert, but like I I do feel, even if we just go off the simple 5 stages of grief, like there there's a lot to it that's more than just sad, but stress doesn't inherently feel sad to me. And as soon as I recognized that what it was grief, there was this like sadness. So I'm curious for you, like, at what point did you really know it wasn't just like stress, anxiety, this is a challenge we have to get through? Actually, this is grief that we're feeling.
To be honest, I think I felt like a few little nuggets of it, but it wasn't until we had actually closed because I still had the responsibility of keeping the business going up until the day that it ended and supporting our small staff that still needed support in whatever way we can. And when it like I'm one of those persons. I'm one of those people who really internalizes stuff for better or for worse. Probably for worse. You're not supposed to do that kind of stuff, but I like really just stuffed it down so that I could keep holding up and be present for the clients till the end and for the staff till the end. And we closed April 30th, and the first few days of May, we were selling some stuff, cleaning it out. And the last day that I was there, someone had come to pick something up, and I walked through the whole birth center. And like, I actually tried to record it because I was like talking about certain things, and I forgot to hit record, but I started crying. Like, yeah, it was fine though, because it was for me anyway.
Yeah.
But it was then I left for the last time, and it just overwhelmingly then became the grief and sadness and not having to hold it together anymore.
So, one of the things I've been unpacking lately is my relationship with failure. I'm pausing because as much as I've shared on this freaking podcast and on other people's podcasts, I talk pretty openly about all my things and all my stuff. And at this point, like I think the number one thing that's made me unemployable is just the sheer amount of personal stuff you can find out about me on the internet because I share it on a podcast. But this is maybe the one of the most vulnerable things have could share, my relationship with failure and the punishment, the self-criticism and the punishment, the shame spiral, the best way I can describe it, and I think I might have used this term on the podcast before, I'm not positive, is this self-flagellation almost that I do this, that I can get into these patterns. Anyways, I've been unpacking this lately over the past month or so, and some of that shows up on this podcast. We've talked a lot about success, redefining goal, like all of that stuff. It's all linked, and I'm curious what's kind of coming up for me, because it's what's top of mind for me right now as we talk about grief, is the relationship between the intensity and the experience of grieving, how it relates to these feelings of failure and feelings of like shame that come with loss. And
Yep.
I'm wondering if this is something we can kind of tiptoe toward. I know it's still very raw for you of what you're experiencing. And so I want to be like mindful of that too. And feel free to set any boundaries that you need. But yeah, I wonder what's coming up for you, especially with your experience supporting women in the big pivots and changes of life, and like the grief that you help women process in transitions of life in general. Yeah. What is the relationship between like failure and grief? Are they linked? Are they different? Like, I don't know.
They're linked because it it would probably be hard not to feel grief from failure. And what's interesting, and I've found it really therapeutic to talk about all of this, to be honest, and it's really only helping navigate the future work that I'm doing also. But this is slightly off topic of what you're asking, but I'll come back to it. I I did notice, like, before we decided to close,
Mhm.
like I was having the feeling of outgrowing
Mm,
the role that I was in, and like obviously, like I said, the goal was to sell, not close the way we did, but I did feel like a sense of outgrowing, and it's just not fitting anymore. And
mm,
so then we decided to close, and it was a huge sense of failure. Like there's so many layers in what had happened, but it's hard to not look at it as a failure and wonder, like, what did I do that caused this? And
mhm,
so there's a lot of grief in that. And I think anyone who, I think especially women, like we carry so much, we wear so much, and like overdoing is our default. And I think if something doesn't work out the way we thought it should, we do see it as a failure. And then there's going to be a sense of grief from that. Like,
mhm.
I don't know. I mean, I guess you could be angry also, but that's one of the stages of grief, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm kind of processing, and I Googled it real quick just to see, like, can I find a definition or something of each that might help me navigate what I think? Because I'm not sure what I think, but I suspect there's something here that is sometimes we assume or identify something as failure when what's actually happening is grief. And what we go to is like shame and punishment and embarrassment and punishing ourselves. I guess I said that, but can you tell that's the thing I'm really stuck on?
Little vibe, yeah.
But we go into that almost as a way to process or react to what we interpret as what happened. Whereas maybe if we could look at things that we automatically go to as failure, and we could say, actually, what's going on is we're grieving, and we're grieving this transition, and we're grieving this change. What role we played in what happened so often is almost actually a moot point, because I'm not trying to say we shouldn't learn from things, because of course we're learning, but learning is ROI, right? Like there's ROI in the lessons that we learn. And so, like, okay, that makes me better. And so, like, the next thing I get to do, I will make I will make decisions that don't go the way I hoped they would, or I will make decisions that hurt other people or myself or whatever, accidentally, not on purpose, but like, yeah, that's going to happen again. However, I'm not going to make the same ones. I'm not going to make the same decisions. Like I learned something from that. And in addition, I think even what you're describing as the feelings that came up for you in closing the birth centers, I had those same exact feelings on such a different situation, such a different scale, maybe, of Amanda letting me know that she wasn't going to continue with either the podcast or Podfox, which was not in the same conversation. It was multiple conversations, but it was like, geez, like when you used examples of like letting employees go, this could be employees choosing to go. This could be you choosing that an employee's done. There's so many things, but we even retiring programs. I'm trying to think of like whoever's listening, right? The person who's listening, you have made decisions that it wasn't necessarily that it failed, but there's grief in that. And instead of calling it grief, we call it failure. A launch flopped. And so instead of grieving that now we have to pivot and we have to change, and this vision or dream that we had, we have to process the release of, instead we go to failure. And so I think like that's a very internalized, I'm the problem. And grief is more like, this is just a part of life. This is a part of owning a business. This is a part of it, and it's hard, but it's not about whose fault it is. It's about moving forward.
I
Is this
so
making
agree
sense?
with you. Oh my God, yes.
I'm just processing in real time.
And while you're talking about it, I wonder how many men don't see it as failure. Just like, oh, that didn't work. No, I mean, third level. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to generalize too much, but women especially though will internalize that as a failure
Yeah.
and
Everything.
yeah.
What's interesting, I think I'm I'm quick to hashtag yes all men. I'm quick to be like angry and hateful toward men. Sorry to the man who's listening, but I at the same time I had a big reaction when you said that. It made me laugh to think of men experiencing grief about like business in the same way that women do. But really that quickly, I do know men personally who internalize senses of failure, who internalize it just looks different, right? The
Yeah.
expectations of what women are supposed to do and who women are supposed to be looks one way. And so the ways we internalize failure looks like one thing. Yeah, for men, it's different. But I kind of think part of the reason so many men are walking out around aggrieved and angry and lost in their own way, it's grief. It's
Yeah.
grief, right? And it's grief and internalized shame. It's a sense of failure to this impossible standard of masculinity that the patriarchy creates, right? And it's pushing men, to be honest, like it's pushing men away from being able to process their relationships and their emotions the way women are allowed to. And so then they don't even know what to do with that. So actually, I think more likely that women could recognize grief than men. I think more likely that men in business would internalize the sense of failure than and not even realize that what they're doing is grieving. I don't think women are great at that either, but I do think women have more access to grief, more access to layered emotions, nuanced emotions, and instead men get angry, right? Like I think that tends to be the reaction. And then that anger is something when it comes to business, that anger is something men take home and take out on the women in their lives, right? And so I think that's such an interesting question. I do think it's different. And I think it's extremely prevalent in society. Frankly, I think it's prevalent in the White House. So, like, I mean, man, if I hate to even call him the president, but he is, if the president of the United States could recognize that change brings grief and that he's experiencing a massive amount of grief and change on an everyday basis instead of failure, I think you'd be a lot less hateful and a lot less angry and a lot less aggressive and a lot less mean. Like, not that it would be that easy to flip a switch because it's 80
Right.
years of internalized anger, right? But no, that's a really interesting question. I don't know what's coming up for you as I kind of pontificate that.
I I massaging what you said about men, and I do agree that they are internalizing it, and
It's just different.
it is it is different.
Is a really really compelling question though, and I think I make an assumption so often that this podcast is mostly women and maybe people that are non-binary or on a gender spectrum are listening to, and then I'll get a message from like a straight white man who's like, hey, you kind of come for straight white men sometimes, and like, yeah, I do, but I also work with some and I think they're and I mean my partner is white presenting and male and straight. So I think that I know that we're all struggling under capitalism. So yeah. So okay, can we talk a little bit from the midwife life perspective, from the rebirth perspective as we're experiencing change? I kind of said, oh, the 5 stages of grief. I don't even know if the 5 stages of grief is like the way we even really talk about grief right now. Like when women are experiencing a pivot, or when people, because I know who you primarily work with is women, but we can, since we're talking about the gender spectrum, let's just kind of even play with that a little bit. But whoever you are, when we find that what we're experiencing, if we're challenging ourselves, like, oh, is this grief that I'm experiencing? Is this grief and change? Like, what can we do? What should we unlearn? What should we deconstruct? How do we navigate that tension? And like, where do we go from there?
Probably identifying it first, like getting down to the root of the trigger and is probably the first place to start. Like because there's so many layers. We talked about all the different ways that the grief might come, and not just for business owners, but people, people in general. But for business owners, entrepreneurs, I think there's so many layers. And I don't know about you. I feel like it also depends on the size of your team that you like kind of wear a shield to. not only protect yourself, but like not let everyone know about everything you're experiencing. So I think it's about trying to break that down if you have one and unpacking what it is that you're working through because you might not really even know right away
Yeah.
what it is. It's
Yeah.
not always instantly identifiable what's causing it.
Yeah. That's like the number one thing so far that I'm personally going to take away from this conversation is I've been trying to catch myself in failure loops. I'm noticing I've learned about myself. I've become more honest about myself that my brain, I have a core belief that I'm failing and it's an active failure, right? Like I'm actively failing. I'm carrying around a constant list of all the things I should be doing that I'm not doing. And I'm really, really not receptive to somebody external telling me I should do something because I get very defensive that I already know all the things I should be doing. Believe me, you don't need to punish me. I'm punishing myself enough. And I feel like I've now come to terms enough with this to be able to say this so bluntly. I definitely, as I've been exploring it, have had some pretty emotional reactions from the people who love me the most when I let them in to how cruel I can be to myself, even about small micro decisions throughout the day. But I think the awareness is so half the battle that like now what I'm trying to do is catch myself in those loops and cut myself off. Like, hang on, we don't need to talk to ourselves that way. And I
Good.
think the
Yeah.
like number one thing that I'm going to take from this is evolving that to not just stopping it, but also asking my heart the question like, are you failing or are you grieving? Because like I think we can experience grief in even these micro moments. And I'm going to pick something super, super silly that I've been using as an example to like the closest people in my life and now my podcast, which is there was this moment that I was driving to a networking meeting and I needed to stop and grab lunch because I hadn't eaten yet that day and I really needed the fuel. And so it was like, okay, there are two drive-throughs that I have the opportunity to pull through on my way from point A to point B. Which one is the right decision? One of them sounded more fun to me from a food standpoint, but the other one is something I'd been craving. I had not had it in a long time. Also, they have Diet Coke and I love Diet Coke. It's my like life's blood.
Amen.
And the other choice, I had never ordered a soda from that restaurant before, so I run the risk that they might have Pepsi. And I like a Diet Pepsi, but that's not what I wanted. Okay. I wanted a Diet Coke. So I was like, okay, I have these two choices. And I'm like, the right choice is clearly the other one, the one that I know has Diet Coke, right? That's the correct choice. I've been craving it. It'll make, I want the other one. That sounds fun. So I decided I'm going to make the practical decision and I'm going to go to the one that I know will be satisfying. It will solve a craving and it will have Diet Coke and it's on the way, right? And I get stuck at a red light on my way there, right at the pull in to the parking lot, to the one that was enticing me, the burrito. And so I decided, fuck it, I'm getting the burrito. And I swing into the parking lot. And there's a line. And so there's people in front of me and people behind me. And I pull up, and not only is it Pepsi, Diane, they don't even have Diet Pepsi. They have Pepsi Zero, which is an affront to Diet Coke drinkers who will not drink a Pepsi Zero.
Oh,
Not in,
it's the
not
devil's urine.
I was trying to like pull out Cat in the Hat, not on a bus, not on a like I
Yeah.
will not drink Pepsi Zero. So now I'm in a drive-through line and I can't pull out because there's people behind me. So I'm stuck getting the burrito, which I am excited about, but now I don't have a Diet Coke. And in fact, I don't have a drink at all. And now because I'm in a line, I'm looking at the clock and I don't have time to stop at another place before I get to my destination for my meeting. So I can't even make an additional stop to get a Diet Coke. And I start beating myself up. This is what you do. You have two choices. You know what the logical decision is, and you still make a bad choice. You can't trust yourself to be spontaneous because when you do get spontaneous, you fuck it up for yourself. I literally caught myself doing this, started laugh crying, and was like, it's a burrito. Like, stop that serious. And I think in that moment, if I could have the framework, and I'm using this as like such a silly example because I do think it's all of the things we're experiencing, right? if I could stop myself in that moment and be like, Sarah, are you the problem? Are you a failure? Can you not trust yourself? Or are you just grieving the fact that today you don't get to have a Diet Coke?
Maybe.
Maybe it's just that. Maybe it's not actually that you're fundamentally untrustworthy to yourself and you can't make good decisions. Maybe it's not that serious. Maybe it's just a drive through. Like, I mean, it's okay. So there's
I think you
probably a
need to
lot
tap
there.
into 8-year-old Sarah.
Yeah, no, there's a therapist listening that's like, girl, please make a therapy appointment. Yeah, I know, don't worry, I'm on it. But I also think it's the big stuff too. And I think we just get into these cycles of like self-flagellation of, I don't know, it can't just be me. So I'm saying it and I'm being vulnerable and I'm being transparent because I know there's somebody listening who's like, oh shit, is that you in the other room? Like, hey, me too.
Not just you.
And if you're listening to this and you can't relate, like I'm so glad you can't. And yeah, it's dark in here. Okay, okay. So anyway, I'm fascinated by this. So I'm curious, in addition to this like kind of tactical side of can we catch ourselves and ask, am I failing or am I grieving? I'm also curious like about this pressure that we feel. Life has to keep going, business has to keep going. And so when somebody resigns or you make a decision to make a massive pivot in your professional career or whatever in between, you pick the wrong drive through, how do you process your grief and like still show your fucking face in stories and get an email out to your list? How do you do it?
It's not easy, especially if you're in a deep, if you're in a deep
Yeah,
version
if
of
it's bigger than a drive through, if you're
this.
closing businesses instead of, yeah, yeah.
I've actually had a similar drive-through experience. I will tell you though, and I
Okay,
was,
thank you.
and it involved a Diet Coke. So
It's the Diet Coke that's the problem.
yeah, exactly. I think it's for me, it was like, oh, sort of a willpower to know that this was a threshold, basically a threshold that have one foot here. I had one foot in my old life and like one foot in the new life that I didn't really even know exactly what it was going to be, but I knew I needed to get there. And
Yeah,
like you can make the decision to wallow in the past and in the grief, but for me, I just needed to take one step forward. So
yeah,
I did not do a lot. Like I didn't do a post every day and probably ran some reruns on my podcast,
yeah,
but I made small steps and those made me feel every little step makes you feel a little bit better, I think.
yeah, yeah. That's so true. Just make some progress.
Moving forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I think too, you've shared some level of your grief online. Part of that is because a lot of people know you as a person who co-owned birth centers for the last 10 years. And so giving an update that that chapter is closed and the new chapter is starting and this is what it looks like, part of it is that, right? And so you have to address it to a certain degree, but you've gone further than that because you've actually spoken a bit about the grief and what you're processing and what you're experiencing. So I'm curious, like what does grieving publicly look like? Where how do you find boundaries in that? And also like, is there a right and wrong way to grieve publicly? Do some people have more access to grieve publicly than others? Like what does this look like?
The access way, I'm not sure, but I have to say it's actually felt really therapeutic for me to do it. And that's surprising for me because I'm
Yeah.
for all the work I've done and having a podcast, I don't feel like I'm a real public facing person like historically, but I like feel that's turning around and it just really has been therapeutic to talk about it. And whenever I have talked about it, like you, people are like, you can share as much as you feel comfortable with. And honestly, I feel like the more I share, the more I release some of the grief. So
Mhm.
the deeper I can talk about
Yeah.
it, the more freeing it is,
Yeah.
which I didn't expect. So it's been a pleasant surprise to have that happen.
Yeah. I I'm reflecting on like how many layers of grief there is to this part of your journey. And like one thing that's really coming up quite a lot for me is being a co-owner. That this wasn't just a unilateral decision that you got to make for yourself. This was a joint decision, and it's a closing of a chapter of not just a business but a partnership. And I'm wondering like, do you want to touch on that of like this is deeper than somebody resigns or somebody needs to be terminated. This is a partner.
Yeah, I said a little bit earlier, I kind of felt like I was outgrowing my role there. And I feel like the partnership felt a little bit like that for me also, like where we had started and
Yeah.
where we're at 10 years
Like
on,
it ran a course.
it ran a course and we were both kind of in a different place. So I I know that we both really wanted to make it successful and we wanted to end up on top and right some wrongs that had happened to us over the last couple of years. But I I think she would have kept going, and I just had to be the voice of reason, and she ultimately agreed. But it, it is something like, yeah, a partnership is a hard thing, and we had a good run, but
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 11 years of working together on this dream like is incredible. An incredible run and it makes me think so much of marriage and like one thing that I say about being a podcast co-host and I would say this about marriage as well, although I haven't really said it on the in the business side, but it's true. It's a legal partnership, right? It is a business agreement. And so that's part of why there's discussion about prenups and things like that. And different states have different regulations and whatever of what happens when you go your separate ways. And like we are entering into business partnership with each other, right? And marriage, I think, ends much the same way, where maybe one person would be willing to keep going, even though it's been really hard and maybe both people agree that things aren't working as is, but one person might be willing to keep fighting the good fight and the other person has to be the one to say I need to step out. I need to end the contract, right? And like that we have the social contract or the legal contract or the business arrangement, whatever it officially is, all of the above, right? Like I need to step away. And that I think there's so much grief in that. And I mentioned Amanda, she was my co-host for the podcast. So in a way, we were business partners for the podcast. She was technically my team member for my business, but for a while it was just me and her. And so there were so many ways that that did feel like losing a partner. And I think that's why there was so much grief in that for me was like, I know our relationship will change in a way it already had and that's why part of the reason why this made sense but like I knew our relationship was going to change. I knew no matter how much we said we're still going to be close, like not like we were once, right? I knew that. And everything's going to look different. The business is going to look different without her in it, without her fingerprint on it. The podcast totally different, still called Big Brave Business. But and I think some of the like general reasons why we started it are still reasons why I do it today. Like we both felt so alone and everyone talked about like a business bestie, and we both felt kind of jealous that people would talk about this concept of a business bestie because we had never felt it until we found each other. And then it was like, oh, this is what it's like. Thank God we have each other. And we wanted other people who talked about business, cared about business, ran their business in similar ways to the way we did. We wanted them to feel that. That's still very much a part of like what I do and why I do it and how I do it. So that part's still there, but I mean, yeah, it looks really different. And so like this obviously it's a totally different business, but this next chapter of entrepreneurship for you looks so different because there's no business partner. It's just you. And in some ways that's so beautiful and exciting and freeing because having a business partner is rough. I love talking people out of having a podcast co-host. But also, that was like a business marriage. And 11 years is a really good run.
I was going to say it really was like a marriage. And if any of your listeners have gone through a divorce, the end felt like that. It was really uncomfortable. And that's because we both had to go through our own grief
Yeah.
processes s-
Yeah.
simultaneously. Well, that was rough to navigate. It really was. And yes, the next chapter of solo entrepreneurship is
Yeah.
beautiful. We
Yeah.
had such a unicorn kind of relationship that we got along that well and we're friends and could run a business that long together. I don't think that is something that happens all the time.
Yeah. What's one thing the person listening who's experiencing a pivot or a transition in their life, what's one thing you hope they'll take away from this conversation or one thing they can put into practice?
I think to not rush the process is probably going to be my number one takeaway. The period of transition from whatever you're doing, a pivot or whatever, like spend a few minutes, by minutes, I mean some time in that threshold area to take some time to release what you're letting go of, grieve it, and don't rush into the next thing because rushing into the next thing is only going to put you back into the same hamster wheel of making maybe some more wrong choices. And I
Yeah.
think just taking the time to really figure out what that next thing is going to be.
Yeah. I guess I would add related, there's no finish line to grief, right? Like
Oh,
grief stays with us forever and it just evolves and looks different. And grief continues to come up again because if grief is part of the change process, change is never going to stop, especially as a business owner. Like we're always going to continue to experience changes and changes and changes and changes, changes to tech, changes to systems, changes to culture, changes to our offer suite, our team, our pricing, our clients, like change, change, change. It's just a constant. And so knowing that that grief process, there is no finish line. You, to your point about don't try to rush it, like you really can't, because there isn't a finish line to cross. Can't race across that. Like you have to process it and find a way to move into your next chapter that honors, like you said, like what you've released, and also know you always carry all the past versions of you into the next version of you. You couldn't be the next version of you without the past versions of you. So it's just like literally a permanent thing. Not that the grief looks the same. So the sadness is not permanent and the anger is not permanent and whatever the other denial and acceptance, well, hopefully acceptance is. No, you know what? I don't think any of it's permanent. I don't think acceptance is permanent either. I think it comes in waves and I think it's not linear. And I think we're constantly healing forever and we don't get to this finish line of like, and now healed. Like I just I'm always healing and I'm always going to be in a state of grief. And so I think, yeah, there's no finish line. So cool. Cheery
I
topic
think,
today,
I
Diane.
think I'm just going to add from what you said though, like there is no finish line and there's always going to be change. So if you do have a big thing that you go through and can recognize it and have some tools, and remember those when you move forward
Yeah.
with your next thing. So that when the grief happens, you know how
Yeah. You
to
know
deal
how
with
to navigate it. Yeah. Can
it.
become
Yeah.
a pro at grieving. Yay. Okay. So this was like super fun and really inspiring and motivating. And I'm sure everybody feels so empowered and
Yeah.
like excited
Agree.
to be a business owner. It was just like really super fun. So I feel like we do need to leave off on like a positive note. What future are you building? What are you excited for in what comes next? What has this grief made space for in your life that you are excited about?
I'm excited that I'm a midwife by training, so I've cared for women through childbirth, and now I can take the skills of that and the experience that I just had of a huge transition and help women go through that in other areas of their life, things that don't have a due date.
Mm, no due date. Wow. Yeah. How interesting. Before we hit record, I was like, "Hey, talk to me about this new vision, your goals, etc. Like, I want to hear where you're at with like planning the new chapter of your life and your business." Now, obviously, because we work together, I know some of this, right? Listen to the podcast, Midwife Life. Then, in a way, you get to continue connecting with both of us because you get to hear Diane, but also my team produced it, so I'm a big fan. But also, just as a chance to catch up and check in and like FaceTime, right? Like talk to me about where you're at. And you had posed the same question back to me of like, what about you, Sarah? What are your goals? And I was like, oh man, realizing in that exact question and answering that like, I don't know, I'm kind of in an identity crisis. And so I think, as you may have noticed from some of my pouring my heart out on this episode, I am going through a massive identity shift myself. And there's a lot of releasing 8-year-old Sarah's stories, patterns, beliefs that I've been carrying for too long. And I am excited that in releasing that, I get to make space to make new goals for myself. And I'm excited about a new level of loving myself in the way I deserve to be loved.
Good.
And I really am genuinely excited about that. I've been doing some deep shitty work this year, and you too. And but yeah, I like I've been motivated to do the work, quote unquote, because I am genuinely so excited to meet the version of me on the other side of this. And you too. I'm excited to continue to get to know the woman on the other side of this chapter of 10 years of owning birth centers. Like, I'm excited to know this next chapter because, yeah, like, truly that being such a part of your identity and like, but how I would describe like who the woman I know, birth center is what you do. It's not who you are to me. Right. And so, like, I love the woman that you are, and I'm so excited to continue to get to know her in this new chapter. And thanks for letting me be part of it. And thanks for being here.
Same to you, Sarah. I'm happy to hear you're gonna be nice to little Sarah.
We're trying. It's a work in progress, but she deserves it. So she's
I,
great. I mean,
I'm doing a
8 year
little
old
work on
Sarah was awesome. So yeah.
that.
So, if for you listening, if you can relate to any of this, or if you have thoughts about grief, if you are experiencing a pivot or transition, which of course you are, obviously we want to talk to you about it. We want to hear about what's going on with you, what came up for you in this episode, what's been working for you, what has not been working for you. Did you hear anything in this episode that was like helpful? We genuinely want to have that conversation with you. So, all of our information and links to connect with us is in the description of the episode. Also, go listen to Diane's podcast because you're going to get a lot more support with regard to like getting midwifed through your whole life and not just through pregnancy and birth of your children. And so come in and connect with us there. And thank you so much to you listening for being here as well. And for like this little group therapy session today. Hopefully we can be focused on the uplifting, what are you looking forward to and what are you excited about building and what is this making space for it. Let's focus on that.
Yes.
But yeah, so anyways, it's been lovely and we'll see you next week.